On Thursday, the 22nd of September, 2022, just before 3 o'clock in the afternoon, a silver Volkswagen Passat turned onto Underwood Close in Harborne, a quiet residential street in Birmingham. The driver was a 43-year-old man named Richard Hopley. In the back seat sat a local drug dealer known only by his street name, Ace. To Richard, this was routine. Another delivery run, another few pounds earned in a life that had been shaped and constrained by addiction. He had no reason to suspect that within minutes he would be fighting for his life. He had no way of knowing that 4 men were waiting, that a plan had been set in motion days earlier, or that the fake £20 note handed over weeks before had already sealed his fate. What began as a robbery would end in a single knife strike delivered with such force that Richard's 5th rib would be severed. His heart punctured and his blood spilled across the front seat of the car he was driving. He would manage to escape the ambush, steer the vehicle half a mile through residential streets, and crash into a parked Mercedes before collapsing. By the time paramedics arrived, it was too late. Richard Hopley was declared dead at the scene. His death would expose a network of resentment, greed, and violence that stretched across Birmingham's underworld, involving drug runners, enforcers, and a man who would later be described in court as the architect of murder. Years later, on Wednesday, the 31st of January 2024, another man welcomed someone into his flat in Erdington just before midnight. Wallace Webb was 65 years old, a former local councillor and a chef at a care home, remembered by colleagues and neighbours as kind-hearted and generous. He lived alone in a high-rise tower block called Cranley House on Boldmore Lake Road. That night, CCTV cameras tracked his blue Hyundai as it travelled to Frederick Road in Gravelly Hill, where a lone figure waited at the corner. By 2:55 in the morning, both men entered the building together. Wallace was never seen alive again. For nearly a week, no one came looking. His brother, living abroad, tried to reach him on Skype. When days passed without an answer, he raised the alarm. On the 6th of February, police forced entry into the flat and found Wallace's body lying naked in his bedroom, already decomposing. Blood patterns on the walls and floor told a story of brutal violence. Multiple stab wounds, the most severe to his neck, had caused catastrophic blood loss. There was no sign of forced entry, no ransacking, no indication of a burglary gone wrong. Everything pointed to the killer being someone Wallace had willingly let inside. While his body lay undiscovered, his bank cards were used to order groceries online, buy takeaway food, and make purchases at local shops. The killer had returned to Cranley House in the days after the murder, either retrieving something or simply acting with arrogance. When investigators pieced together the digital trail, CCTV timestamps, financial transactions, and mobile phone records, they found a timeline so precise it left no room for doubt. The man responsible was 25 years old, and he had made no attempt to disguise his involvement. This is the story of Richard Hopley and Wallace Webb, 2 men whose deaths, though separated by time and circumstance, share a common thread. They were carried out in ordinary places, by men who believed they could outsmart the system, and they were solved not by luck, but by the meticulous work of detectives who refused to let violence go unanswered. Welcome to a true crime documentary that takes you inside 2 investigations, 2 trials, and 2 very different kinds of murder. Let's begin. Before we go deeper, subscribe if you love true crime documentaries grounded in real investigative work, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from, whether you're in the UK or following these chilling true stories from abroad. Richard Hopley was 43 years old when he died. To those who knew him best, his family, his mother, the people who had watched him grow up, he was a kind son who had struggled for years with addiction. That dependency had pushed him into a dangerous world, one where debts were settled with violence and disputes were never forgotten. By 2022, Richard was working as a driver for a Birmingham drug dealer. It was a role that kept him on the edge of the trade, close enough to earn money, but never far from danger. He was not a major player, not a kingpin or a trafficker. He was a man trying to survive in a system that offered few exits. His job was simple: drive the car, drop off the product, collect the cash, and stay quiet. But in the drug economy of Birmingham, a city where territories are fiercely guarded and grudges are long-lived, even peripheral roles carry risk. Richard's role placed him in proximity to people who operated by different rules, people for whom violence was not a last resort but a business tool. And on the 22nd of September, his proximity to that world would cost him his life. The roots of the conflict that led to Richard's death began with something small, a fake £20 note. Nicholas Stallard, a long-time drug user in his 40s, had handed it over to the dealer known locally as Ace. It was a transaction that might have been forgotten in a different context, but in the world Stallard and Ace inhabited, trust was currency, and betrayal, even accidental, was not tolerated. Ace confronted Stallard. Words were exchanged. The relationship soured. Stallard, angry and humiliated, saw an opportunity for revenge. He began speaking to others in the area, people who had their own grievances, their own reasons to want Ace taken down. One of those people was Ayub Khan. At 29 years old, Khan was known in his area of Harborne. He was not a bystander or a minor player. In court, he would later be described as the architect of what was to come. Prosecutors would argue that Khan was the one who conceived the plan, who chose the location, who coordinated the roles, and who stood back while others carried out the violence. Alongside him was Muhammad Kasim, just 24 years old at the time. Kasim worked as Khan's drug runner, younger, more vulnerable, but armed and willing to act. Stallard and his associate Paul Hales became the enforcers. One in his 40s, the other in his 60s. They brought numbers and presence to the plan. Their role was simple: intimidate, back up the threats, and make sure the dealer they lured in couldn't resist. Together, these four men formed a crew bound not by loyalty or friendship, but by a shared desire to rob Ace of his drugs and cash. They believed they could do it without consequence. They were wrong. Ayub Khan had chosen the ground carefully. Underwood Close, a quiet residential road in Harborne, seemed ordinary to anyone passing through. But to Khan, it offered cover and escape. A narrow alleyway sat close by, an easy route out if the plan went wrong. The street was quiet enough that neighbors were unlikely to intervene, but public enough that it wouldn't draw suspicion if someone saw a car pull up. On the afternoon of Thursday, the 22nd of September, 2022, the group put their scheme into motion. The gang believed they could lure Ace to the address and strip him of drugs and cash. The bait was simple: a meeting arranged for business. Ace had no reason to suspect anything unusual. He got into the back seat of Richard Hopley's Volkswagen Passat, and Richard drove. To Richard, it was another ride, another day in a life where his role as a driver placed him close to the shadows of the trade. What he couldn't know was that this trip would put him directly in the crosshairs of four men. As the Passat pulled up on Underwood Close, Muhammad Kasim made his move. Just 24 years old, he was Khan's drug runner, and on that day, he carried the knife. He slid into the front passenger seat and brandished the blade. His demands were clear: hand over the drugs. The robbery was underway, but chaos followed quickly. Richard, sitting just feet away, tried to intervene. He grabbed at Kasim, preventing him from slipping out of the car. In that instant, the threat of robbery escalated into violence. With the blade already drawn, Kasim lashed out. A single strike delivered with severe force drove into Richard's chest. It cut through the rib and heart in one motion. Outside, the other men moved in. Stallard lunged at the car, reaching for the keys in the ignition, trying to stop it from moving. Hales came up alongside and smashed the driver's window, shattering glass across the seat. For a few moments, the vehicle became the center of a desperate struggle. A dealer pinned in the back, his driver wounded, and three attackers surrounding them. What began as a planned robbery had in seconds turned into something darker and irreversible. The attack lasted only moments, but the damage was already done. Somehow, despite the catastrophic wound, Richard managed to keep the car moving. He pressed the accelerator, dragging Stallard away from the vehicle as it lurched forward. Kasim fled the scene, as did Hales. Khan, who had held his own knife but never stepped in, stood apart. In seconds, the four men scattered and left the scene. The Passat traveled a short distance, swerving across the narrow residential roads. Richard tried to keep control, but the injury and the blood loss were too severe, his grip weakening with every passing second. Around half a mile from the ambush, on Metchley Lane in Harborne, The car left the road and struck a parked Mercedes. Passers-by and residents were the first to notice. People came running from nearby houses. Someone dialed 999. Emergency services arrived within minutes. Paramedics worked desperately to revive him, but the wound was fatal. The single strike had been delivered with such force that his fifth rib had been severed. Nothing could be done, and he was declared dead at the scene. Police cordoned off the area quickly. The blood on Richard's clothes, the broken window, and the accounts of witnesses pointed to a violent struggle that hadn't ended with the crash. This was not an accident. This was a crime scene. The crash on Metchley Lane left little doubt about what had happened. Within hours, detectives from West Midlands Police's homicide team began piecing together the attack. In the world of real crime documentary investigation, the work that follows a murder is methodical, exhaustive, and often invisible to the public. It begins with the scene itself. Forensic officers documenting blood spatter patterns, collecting glass fragments, photographing the position of the body and bagging every item that might carry DNA or fingerprints. But in this case, the most critical evidence was not found in the wreckage of the car. It was found in the digital footprint left behind by the attackers. Detectives began with CCTV. Cameras across Harborne were checked, tracing the movements of Richard's car in the hours leading up to the crash on Metchley Lane. The footage placed the vehicle on Underwood Close, the spot where the ambush unfolded. But CCTV alone doesn't tell you who was inside a car or why they were there. Investigators turned to phone records. Cell site data mapped the locations of key suspects, placing them in the area at the time of the attack. In modern criminal investigations, cell site analysis is one of the most powerful tools available to detectives. Every time a mobile phone connects to a network, whether to make a call, send a text, or simply remain on, it pings the nearest cell tower. By mapping which towers a phone connected to and at what times, investigators can trace the movements of a suspect with remarkable precision. In this case, phone data placed multiple suspects in Harborne at the time of the ambush. Analysis of calls and messages added another layer, showing clear contact between those later identified as part of the group. CCTV also played a role after the stabbing, with some cameras capturing members of the gang as they fled. These images, combined with the phone data, helped detectives confirm who had been involved. Witness accounts supported the timeline. Piece by piece, the evidence revealed not a spontaneous street fight, but 4 men acting together in a planned robbery. This was a coordinated attack, and the police knew it. The first breakthrough came quickly. Within a few days, 2 men were arrested. Nicholas Stallard and Paul Hales had both been identified as part of the group that confronted the Volkswagen Passat. Their involvement was clear from CCTV, witness statements, and their own phone records, but the 2 men most responsible for the violence were nowhere to be found. Muhammad Kasim, the man identified as the one who had delivered the fatal stab wound, fled to Pakistan within days. Ayub Khan, later described in court as the organizer of the plan, also disappeared overseas, believed to be in Pakistan too. Their sudden absence confirmed to police that the attack had been more than a random assault. It was a carefully conceived robbery that had spiraled into murder. For months, investigators worked quietly. Surveillance continued, financial records were checked, and international alerts were issued. Detectives were certain the 2 missing men would one day return, and when they did, they would face the same scrutiny as the accomplices already in custody. In the meantime, the case against Stallard and Hales moved forward. Both men were charged with manslaughter and conspiracy to rob. The prosecution's argument was clear. Even if they had not delivered the fatal blow, their role in the robbery was active and violent. They had smashed the window, tried to stop the car, and participated in a plan that led directly to Richard Hopley's death. Under English law, if you participate in a violent crime and someone dies as a result, you can be held accountable for that death, even if you were not the one who struck the fatal blow. This principle, known as joint enterprise, is one of the most controversial and powerful tools in the criminal justice system. It means that everyone involved in a crime shares responsibility for its consequences. Stallard and Hales would stand trial first, while the hunt for Kasim and Khan continued overseas. The first men to face justice were Nicholas Stallard and Paul Hales. They were not accused of delivering the fatal stab wound, but the prosecution made clear that their role in the robbery was active and violent. At Birmingham Crown Court, both were charged with manslaughter and conspiracy to rob. The jury accepted their involvement, and in 2023, they were convicted. Stallard, then 43, was sentenced to 13 years in prison. Hales, aged 65, received 10 years. For Richard's family, it marked the beginning of accountability, though they knew two of the men most responsible were still overseas. The sentencing brought some measure of closure, but it was incomplete. Richard's mother, in a victim impact statement read in court, described the pain of losing her son and the frustration of knowing that the man who had stabbed him was still beyond the reach of British justice. She spoke of Richard's kindness, his struggles, and the life he had tried to rebuild despite his addiction. Her words were a reminder that behind every crime statistic, every courtroom verdict, every dark history, there is a family left to grieve. The second major trial came months later, when Muhammad Kasim returned to the UK. By late 2023, Pakistani authorities had become aware of his presence, and after coordination with British law enforcement, he was arrested at the airport upon his return. He denied murder, claiming instead that the dealer in the back seat had been the one to lash out with the knife. It was, he argued, an accident that had fatally wounded Richard as the car was attacked. The jury rejected his account. CCTV, phone evidence, and forensic detail placed him at the center of the murder. The court ruled that Kasim played a central role and that the knife was not produced by chance. Forensic analysis of the wound confirmed that the strike had been delivered with significant force, angled downward, and consistent with an attacker seated in the front passenger seat. The pathologist testified that the blade had severed Richard's fifth rib, passed through the intercostal muscles, and punctured the left ventricle of the heart. The injury was immediately life-threatening, and death would have been rapid, though not instantaneous. This detail was critical because it explained how Richard had been able to drive away from the scene despite the fatal wound. His body, in shock and flooding with adrenaline, kept him conscious long enough to steer the car half a mile before he finally collapsed. Judge Paul Farrer, King's Counsel, told Kasim he had intended to kill, even if the attack had not been premeditated. The judge noted that Kasim had armed himself with a knife, entered the car with the intention of robbing the occupants, and used lethal force when challenged. The law recognizes that intent to kill can be formed in seconds, and in this case, the jury was satisfied that Kasim had made a choice in that moment, a choice that ended Richard Hopley's life. Kasim, then 24, was convicted of murder and conspiracy to rob. He was sentenced to life imprisonment to serve a minimum of 30 years. Ayub Khan managed to stay beyond the reach of British justice for more than a year. In Pakistan, he married and started a family, building a new life while the men he left behind faced trial. But in September 2023, he returned to the UK believing he could avoid implication. His gamble would collapse in the courtroom. At trial, Khan attempted to distance himself from the role prosecutors described as central. He presented himself as a man of limited capacity, someone with learning difficulties, low intelligence, and little influence over those around him. Psychological assessments initially appeared to support his claims, with one expert suggesting he had an IQ of just 47. But the deception unraveled when a second psychologist reviewed his case and concluded he was of average intelligence, fully aware of his actions and the choices he had made. The court was told Khan had deliberately exaggerated his difficulties during the first assessment, attempting to mislead experts and downplay his role in the crime. This was not the first time a defendant had tried to feign intellectual disability to avoid responsibility, and the court was not fooled. At one stage, the court even heard comparisons with the 1995 crime thriller The Usual Suspects. In that film, Kevin Spacey's character, Roger Verbal Kint, convinces police he is a harmless, disabled man caught up in events beyond his control. Only at the very end is it revealed he is, in fact, the elusive criminal mastermind. Like Kint, Khan tried to play the role of the innocent dupe. But unlike the film's character, Khan's illusion was exposed before the jury. The jury was also told that Khan had waited until his co-defendants had been convicted before returning to Britain, a calculated move that suggested he had been monitoring the case from abroad. and waiting to see if the evidence against him would hold. Judge Paul Farrer, King's Counsel, described him as the architect of the plan and the dominant force among the four. The jury convicted him of murder and conspiracy to rob. He was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 30 years before parole could even be considered. With Khan's conviction, the case was closed. 4 men had been held accountable for Richard Hopley's death, but there was one key figure who never appeared in court, the dealer known only as Ace, the man whose dispute with Stallard had triggered the plan in the first place. He fled the scene soon after Richard's death and has never been traced. To this day, he remains outside the reach of police and the courts, a ghost in a story that claimed the life of a man who was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. At the heart of the second case were 2 very different men whose paths crossed in the early weeks of 2024. Wallace Webb was 65 years old. To his neighbors and those who knew him best, he was remembered as kind-hearted, compassionate, and deeply committed to fairness. He had once served briefly as a local councillor, motivated by a desire to help others in his community. In more recent years, he worked as a chef in a care home, where colleagues said his love of cooking and care for people shone through. His family described him as someone who would do anything for anyone, but behind that public warmth, he lived a quieter, more solitary life. He occupied a flat in Cranley House, a tower block on Boldmore Lake Road in Erdington. He was single, and those closest to him knew that he sometimes turned to Birmingham's gay village and online chat sites to meet people. His brother, who lived abroad, kept in touch regularly, often through Skype calls. Wallace's life, like many people's, contained private spaces that even those closest to him did not fully see. He was a man who lived alone, who valued his independence, but who also sought connection in a world that can be isolating for older single men, particularly those in the LGBTQ community. His use of online platforms to meet people was not unusual. It is a reality for millions of people around the world, but it placed him in contact with individuals whose motives were not always clear. The man who would eventually take Wallace's life was 25-year-old Sakandar Hussain. From Erdington himself, Hussein's life looked very different. He came from a low-income background and carried with him a history of instability. Reports from the trial revealed he often used dating apps and websites to meet men. He told investigators that he was bisexual and admitted to having had multiple relationships with older men, some of which included being paid for sex. Hussain later claimed he was vulnerable, presenting himself as someone with a very low IQ and as an individual who had been exploited by others. This narrative of a young, vulnerable man preyed upon by older, wealthier men would become a key part of his defense. But prosecutors would argue that it was Hussain who was the predator, that he had deliberately targeted Wallace, and that the killing was not an act of self-defense but a calculated robbery that ended in murder. How exactly the 2 men came into contact remains guarded. Prosecutors suggested it was through one of these online or social avenues, though neither side provided a definitive account. What is certain is that by the end of January 2024, Hussain and Webb had arranged to meet, an arrangement that would end in violence and tragedy. On the night of Tuesday, the 30th of January 2024, Wallace Webb left his flat just before midnight. CCTV cameras tracked his blue Hyundai as it made its way towards Frederick Road in Gravelly Hill. At around 2:40 in the morning, the car flashed its headlights at the corner of Hunton Hill, where a lone man, Sakandar Hussain, was waiting. This detail, the flashing headlights, suggests a pre-arranged meeting, a signal between 2 people who had agreed to meet in a specific location at a specific time. By 2:55 in the morning, the car returned to Boldmore Lake Road. CCTV outside Cranley House recorded both men entering the building together. Hussain was seen carrying a backpack. It was the last confirmed footage of Wallace alive. Inside the flat, the timeline was chillingly precise. At 3:07 in the morning, Wallace's smart television was activated, with records later showing searches linked to adult content. This detail, while uncomfortable, is critical to understanding the sequence of events. It suggests that in the initial minutes after returning to the flat, both men were still alive, and the encounter had not yet turned violent. At 3:37 in the morning, his mobile phone was last used. Less than 15 minutes later, at 3:51 in the morning, a purchase of £128 was made using his bank card. Prosecutors later argued that this first transaction must have been carried out inside the flat, while Wallace lay fatally injured or perhaps already dead. The timing of this transaction is crucial. It places the moment of violence between 3:37 and 3:51 in the morning, a window of just 14 minutes. At 3:58 in the morning, CCTV picked up a figure leaving Cranley House. The man was carrying both a backpack and an additional bag. Investigators identified him as Hussein. After this moment, Wallace Webb was never seen alive again. For nearly a week, no one in Birmingham knew what had happened inside Cranley House. Wallace Webb lived alone, but he kept in regular contact with his brother. The two would speak twice a week over Skype. When days passed without an answer, concern began to grow. By the 6th day, his brother knew something was wrong and raised the alarm with West Midlands Police. On the morning of the 6th of February, 2024, officers went to Wallace's flat on Boldmore Lake Road. With no response, they forced entry. What they found inside confirmed those fears. Wallace was discovered lying in his bedroom. He was naked, his body already showing signs of decomposition after several days. Blood patterns inside the flat suggested the violence had taken place there and that Wallace had little chance of escape. The scene was grim, and forensic examination quickly identified multiple stab wounds, the most severe to his neck. The injuries had caused catastrophic blood loss, and experts were able to narrow the time of death to the early hours of the 31st of January, aligning with the CCTV and digital evidence later presented in court. The flat itself showed no signs of forced entry. There was no ransacking, no indication of a burglary gone wrong. Everything pointed to the killer being someone whom Wallace had willingly let inside. Prosecutors later described the killing as targeted, calculated, and cruel. They told the jury that this was not a random break-in or an unplanned scuffle, but a deliberate act within the safety of Wallace's own home, a space where he should have been secure. From the moment officers stepped out of Cranley House, the case was treated as a homicide. Detectives from the West Midlands Police Homicide Team took over, beginning the urgent task of piecing together who Wallace had been with in his final hours and why his life had ended in such a brutal way. The first and most telling clue was the CCTV footage. Investigators traced Wallace's movements from the moment he left his flat to the moment Hussein entered the building with him. But CCTV alone doesn't provide motive or method. For that, detectives turned to Wallace Webb's financial records, which provided a precise timeline of transactions and ultimately solid and undeniable evidence against his killer. While Wallace Webb's body remained undiscovered inside Cranley House, his killer wasted no time making use of what he had taken. Within hours of leaving the flat in the early morning of the 31st of January, Sakandar Hussein began spending. One of his first acts was to set up an online Tesco delivery to his own home. The order, placed using Wallace's bank card, totaled more than £255. It was a bold move. The goods were arranged to be delivered directly to Hussein's own address, leaving behind a clear digital trail. This was not the action of a careful criminal attempting to cover his tracks. This was the action of someone who either believed he would not be caught or who simply did not care. His spree didn't end there. Later that same day, he used a stolen card to buy food at a Big John's takeaway on Sutton New Road in Erdington. In the days that followed, he continued to make purchases at local shops, including Costa and other branches of Tesco, spending well over £400 in total. Not content with the cash already obtained, Hussein even went so far as to contact New Day Finance in an attempt to have a block lifted on one of Wallace's credit cards. Investigators later revealed how this showed not only his opportunism, but also his audacity. He believed he could continue draining the accounts without consequence. Perhaps most chillingly, Hussein returned to Cranley House in the days after the killing. Detectives later confirmed his presence back at the tower block, though what he did there remains uncertain. Whether it was an attempt to retrieve something or simply a show of arrogance, it added to the picture of a man who felt untouchable. Throughout this time, Hussein showed no sign of remorse and made no attempt to disguise his involvement. The very actions he took to benefit himself in those days became some of the most important evidence against him. In the world of crime investigation, it is often the criminal's behavior after the crime that seals their fate. Forensic evidence can be challenged, witnesses can recant, but financial records and CCTV footage are objective and undeniable. Hussein's spending spree was, in effect, a confession. Digital records and CCTV evidence pointed to one name, 25-year-old Sikandar Hussein. On the 7th of February 2024, just a day after Wallace's body had been discovered, officers moved in and arrested him at an address on Ingleton Road in Birmingham. From the very beginning, Hussein tried to distance himself from the killing. His first explanation was elaborate. He told investigators he had been blackmailed by another man he claimed to have met in a sauna. According to this story, he had only been looking after Wallace's belongings under duress, and others were to blame for the violence. Detectives quickly revealed the flaws in his account, and as the evidence against him mounted, Hussein changed direction. By the time the case reached Birmingham Crown Court, Hussein had admitted to fraud, acknowledging that he had used Wallace's bank and credit cards in the days after his death. But on the charge of murder, he pleaded not guilty. He claimed instead that he had acted in self-defense, insisting that Wallace had attacked him first and that the fatal stabbing was not deliberate. This claim raised critical questions. If Hussein had been attacked and acted in self-defense, why did he not call the police? Why did he leave Wallace's body in the flat and immediately begin spending his money? Why did he return to the tower block in the days that followed? And why, if he was truly a victim, did he lie to investigators about how he came to have Wallace's belongings? The trial lasted 4 weeks. Prosecutors presented the CCTV timeline, the financial records, the forensic evidence, and the lack of any evidence to support Hussein's version of events. They argued that Hussein had deliberately targeted Wallace, that he had gone to the flat with the intention of robbing him, and that when Wallace resisted or became aware of what was happening, Hussein had killed him. The defense argued that Hussein was a vulnerable young man with a low IQ, that he had been exploited by older men in the past, and that the killing was not premeditated. They pointed to the lack of evidence showing that Hussein had planned the attack in advance, and they suggested that the violence had erupted spontaneously during a confrontation. But the jury was not persuaded. After more than 10 hours of deliberation, they delivered their verdict: guilty of murder. Hussein had already admitted fraud by false representation, but the murder conviction sealed his fate. In January 2025, at Northampton Crown Court, Sikandar Hussein was sentenced. The judge described the crime as heinous, calling Hussein's behavior callous and remorseless. He was ordered to serve life imprisonment with a minimum term of 21 years before he could even be considered for release. The judge noted that Hussein had shown no remorse, that he had lied repeatedly to investigators, and that his actions after the killing, the spending spree, the return to the tower block, the attempt to lift the block on Wallace's credit cards, demonstrated a complete lack of empathy for his victim. For Wallace Webb's family, the sentencing brought a measure of justice, but it could not undo the loss. His brother, in a victim impact statement read in court, described the pain of losing a man who had always been there for others, who had dedicated his life to helping people, and who had been taken in the most brutal way imaginable. He spoke of the difficulty of learning what had happened, of knowing that Wallace had died alone, and of the frustration of realizing that the man who killed him had spent days spending his money while his body lay undiscovered. The statement was a reminder that behind every case of real crime, every investigation, every trial, there are families left to grieve, to search for answers, and to live with a loss that no verdict can fully address. These two cases, though separated by time, geography, and circumstance, share a common thread. They are stories of violence carried out in ordinary places, a quiet residential street, a high-rise flat, by men who believed they could act with impunity. Richard Hopley was a driver, a man on the edge of Birmingham's drug trade, caught in a robbery that spiraled into murder. Wallace Webb was a chef, a former counsellor, a man who lived alone and sought connection in a world that can be isolating. Both were killed by men who made choices to arm themselves, to target others, to use violence and to lie when confronted with the consequences. And both cases were solved not by luck, but by the methodical work of detectives who used CCTV phone records, financial data, and forensic evidence to piece together timelines, identify suspects, and build cases that would stand up in court. In the world of investigative documentary, these tools, cell site analysis, digital forensics, transaction records, are the backbone of modern policing. They allow investigators to reconstruct events with precision, to confirm or disprove alibis, and to hold criminals accountable even when they flee the country or lie about their involvement. The legacy of these cases is not just in the sentences handed down or the justice delivered. It is in the reminder that violence has consequences, that no one is untouchable, and that the work of criminal investigation, though often invisible, is essential to a functioning society. Richard Hopley and Wallace Webb are gone, but their stories remain a testament to the lives they lived, the violence they suffered, and the system that worked, however slowly, to hold their killers accountable. This is the chilling, true story of two murders, two investigations, and the men who thought they could get away with it. But in the end, the evidence spoke louder than their lies, and justice, though delayed, was served.